Hi guys, this week we are going to be talking through land protection, funding strategies, and mechanisms. So where does land conservation funding come from? The overall breakdown of this, if we look across the U.S., of course, varies year to year. It varies by region. Typically, federal funding forms the largest share, with state and local funding and private donors contributing smaller amounts, but still significant portions of the pie. A generalized estimate of that breakdown is about 50 to 60% federal, 30 to 40% state and local, and 10 to 20% private or philanthropic dollars. Each source, of course, is crucial, as they are often combined in a collaborative effort to ensure the success of conservation projects. Federal dollars for conservation come in several different pots. There are a lot of important federal funding sources that we see in the U.S. Each, of course, has its own purpose and strategies for how they invest funding for land conservation and what they are willing to invest in. The Land and Water Conservation Fund, or LWCF, was established in 1965. It's one of the most significant sources, or the most significant source of federal funding for land conservation. Its primary purpose is to provide funding for the acquisition and protection of public lands. That, of course, includes national parks, national forest, and national wildlife refuges. But it also has programs that help to fund state and local parks for recreational programs. The fund is supported by offshore oil and gas drilling revenues, and it is authorized for up to $900 million annually. In 2020, the Great American Outdoors Act made this funding permanent, meaning that the full amount can now be directed to conservation projects each year. That was a really big deal. In prior years, although it was authorized for up to $900 million, it was generally a fraction of that amount. So the Great American Outdoors Act fully and permanently authorized LWCF. Some of the programs that fall under LWCF that are important to talk through are listed here. The Forest Legacy Program is managed by the U.S. Forest Service. It provides funding to states directly to protect environmentally and economically important working forest from conversion to non-forest uses. And that program helps conserve these forests for the benefit of recreation, ecological benefits, and of course also the timber industry. That program was funded with annual allocations. These can vary, but are typically in the tens of millions of dollars. States work in partnership with federal agencies and private landowners to identify the priority areas for conservation. There's a state coordinator in each state for that program that helps to decide where those funds might be directed. Most recently, we had an extra $700 million of Forest Legacy authorized in a big spending bill, the IRA, a couple of years ago, which has been a big deal for that program. Farm Bill conservation programs, the purpose of these, the U.S. Department of Agriculture administers these primarily through NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And these programs are designed to help private landowners preserve and improve the quality of their lands through conservation easements, through conservation planning, and financial assistance. So an example of one of the programs under NRCS is the Conservation Reserve Program. which essentially provides rental payments and cost share assistance to farmers to convert environmentally sensitive agricultural land into conservation uses. The Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, ACEP, is used to help protect agricultural land from development and can be used to help restore wetlands. And since 2018, the Farm Bill has allocated around $60 billion over 10 years for conservation programs, with an increasing focus on land preservation for climate resilience. Another program that I've worked with a lot is the North American Wetlands Conservation Act program, or NAWCA. The NAWCA is to provide grants to support conservation of wetlands and associated upland habitats, specifically for the benefit of migratory birds and other sensitive wildlife. Waterfowl are a focus of this program, as well as threatened and endangered species. This program really encourages public-private partnerships and has a flexible approach that allows us to use those funds to accomplish a lot across a larger project area. That program provides matching grants that help to leverage private investment, and since its inception in 1989, NAWCA has funded over 3,000 projects and protected more than 30 million acres of wetlands. It's typically funded around 50 or 60 million a year. The Coastal Estuarine Land Conservation Program is administered by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. CALP provides matching grants to state and local governments to protect coastal and estuarine lands that have significant conservation, recreation, and ecological value. That program focuses on protecting lands that are threatened by development or environmental degradation. CALP grants can range from $5 million to $10 million per year, with the potential for additional state and matching funds to come into those grants. They can be used for fee acquisition or for the acquisition of conservation easements. Section 6, Endangered Species Funds, flows through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That funding is provided to states and territories to help conserve species listed as endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act. So they support land acquisition, habitat restoration, and other activities that are known to benefit listed species. Section 6 grants are typically in the tens of millions of dollars per year. Last is the Migratory Bird Conservation Fund. The MBCF is generated through the sale of duck stamps and is used to acquire and protect wetland and grassland habitats that are critical for migratory bird populations and specifically for waterfowl. And those funds are generally used to fund the expansion of the National Wildlife Refuge System. So each year, the sale of duck stamps generates around $40 million a year to the fund, with additional revenues from fines and penalties related to migratory bird violations that are added to that fund to be used for acquisition. So just a little more on the Great American Outdoors Act that was passed in 2020. At that time, it provided billions of dollars in funding for trails and parks and the acquisition of public land, protection of public land and waters across the country. As we already discussed, it included the permanent funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, but also funding for a backlog of maintenance needs on national parks, national forests, and other public lands. So in total, that bill directed as much as $2.8 billion a year to public lands, outdoor recreation, maintenance and restoration, and new green spaces. This was a huge victory at a unanticipated time. It was, of course, during the pandemic, and a time when folks were getting out and enjoying public lands more than ever. So there was a heightened awareness of the importance of these spaces, and it ended up being the right moment to pursue this conservation win. The outdoor community, the conservation community, and hundreds of other partners had worked to establish this bill for years, really about 30 years. The coalition had been working together to have this accomplished. So the NAWCA program, the North American Wetland Conservation Act program, is one that's near and dear to my heart. I've worked on probably 30 or 40 NAWCA grants over my career. These grants used to be capped at $1 million per application. They're now capped at $3 million. They require matching funds in order to score well on your proposal, and ideally you are demonstrating that you have 2-to-1 match. So for a $3 million application, you're demonstrating that you're bringing at least $6 million in non-federal funds and leverage for that proposal. As we already mentioned, it's a big year for NAWCA with 30 years and 30 million acres protected. Over the last 3 decades, this program's worked with over 6,000 partners to accomplish those acres. The benefits, of course, are for waterfowl, have been extraordinary, and are often used as a case study for success of how we can help to bring imperiled species back through the strategy of land conservation. NAWCA can also be used for wetland restoration and enhancement. And again, it's just been a really important funding source. There are additional funds administered by NAWCA, sort of set aside for coastal areas. So it's a little bit easier to be competitive with this program if you have a coastal project. So the REPI program, since 2003, has worked on encroachment management for military installations. The program's protected nearly 830,000 acres of land in 118 locations in 35 states and territories. It's overseen by the Secretary of Defense and implemented by military services at really any of the military installations. So the goal of the project is to preserve vital missions at key installations, and Congress has raised REPI's original funding from about $12 million in FY 2005 to $105 million in FY 2021. So DoD has over $1 billion of investment in this program and has attracted another $1 billion in partner contributions. And REPI projects have really proven to be cost-effective and a way to promote installation, military installation resilience, protecting mission capabilities that are at risk, while also protecting species and habitats. Specifically, what we mean by that is, generally speaking, it is best for a military installation to have a low-density human population surrounding it. If you think about an Air Force base that is flying critical missions, not only would nearby human communities complain about the noise and such, there's a risk of military plane were to go down at takeoff or landing. And it is a benefit to the military to have sort of low human population or no human population surrounding military installations. And that goes for other types of installations as well. You can kind of carry the logic out from there. So what we found is maybe uncommon bedfellows between the military and their desire to protect critical missions and habitat and conservation, and that these areas can be managed and maintained for the protection of wildlife. So a lot of U.S. states have established their own land conservation funding programs to complement federal efforts and also to address local priorities. The state programs vary widely in scope. They vary widely in funding levels, the mechanisms that they're using. Often they rely on bonds. They may rely on a real estate transfer fee or transaction fee. Sometimes they're just general appropriated funding by the state or have some dedicated tax revenues. There are roughly 20 states with these types of programs. A couple of examples of state programs. The Florida Forever program is one of the highest state funding levels across the country. There are about 10 million acres in Florida that are managed for conservation. More than 2.6 million have been purchased through the Florida Forever program. Since its inception in 2001, the state has purchased almost a million acres, 907,000 acres of land with $3.3 billion. That program is funded at least 100 million a year. In contrast, we see quite a few states coming in the tens of millions a year. The South Carolina Conservation Bank is an example of that. We've seen that over the past 20 years since its inception, being authorized at around 20 million. We've seen that fluctuate to almost nothing during the Great Recession, up to over $30 million in other years. That program has protected 390,000 acres, and for real estate valued at almost $1 billion, and with the investment of 279 million over the years. It's interesting to kind of compare and contrast these programs. One of the things that happened with the State Conservation Bank in South Carolina was at its inception, that program had a dedicated funding source through the real estate transfer tax that helped to accumulate the funds that it awarded out. And during the last round of authorization, that dedicated funding source was lost, and the program is now dependent on appropriations to move forward. So having a dedicated funding source can be helpful for these kind of programs. So we're stepping it down from federal to state to local funding mechanisms for land conservation. And local ballot measures are a really important way for communities across the U.S. to raise funds and protect natural resources, open space, create recreational lands around their community. The initiatives are often involve voters approving some tax mechanism, a bond, or some sort of fee dedicated for the purpose of the program, for open space, parks, wildlife habitat, or farmland. And there are lots of different examples of these across the country. So let's talk through a few of the examples of when land protection is on the ballot. Property tax measures. So a lot of counties or municipalities might raise funds for land conservation through a property tax increase. An example of this is in Boulder, Colorado, where voters have consistently supported tax extension for increases for the preservation and open space program there. In 2020, Boulder passed a tax extension that generated millions for land preservation in that community. A tax sales measure, a sales tax increase can be used for land conservation, particularly in areas where local governments are seeking to protect large areas of land. In Missouri, many counties have implemented a sales tax to support land and water conservation through initiatives like the Parks and Soil Sales Tax, and that funds conservation efforts across the state. In San Diego County, California, in 2022, voters approved Measure D, which included a sales tax increase to fund parks creation and land conservation. Bond measures. Local governments frequently use bonds to fund any kind of capital project. These can include to fund conservation projects, and that's where revenue can be raised up front by issuing bonds to be repaid later through taxes. So an example of this is in Los Angeles County, California. In 2016, the voters approved Measure A, a $94 million annual bond measure that provides funding for parks and open space preservation there. And last one I mentioned was the source of funding for the South Carolina Conservation Bank can also be implemented at a local level. A real estate transfer fee can allow for a percentage of the sale price of a real estate transaction to fund land conservation. So towns like Amherst, Massachusetts have used real estate transfer fees under a Community Preservation Act to fund conservation projects there. It seems like the appropriate time to sort of touch on the conservation easement tax deduction as a way that we actually fund conservation easement in the U.S. The exact number of individuals who have done this or the exact amount that this adds up to annually is hard to put our fingers on. So although we can't pinpoint that, our best estimate is that over the past 10 years or so, 50,000 to 70,000 individuals have claimed conservation easement tax deductions. These would be in the billions of dollars. And there's been a notable increase in the use of that tax incentive, which became permanent in 2015. And there's also been a crackdown on abuse of this tax shelter mechanism through something we call syndicated conservation easements. We'll probably talk a little bit more about this later in the semester. But for this week, make sure and read Chapter 5 in your textbook that deals with tax deductions, valuation of conservation easements, and how that fits into the big picture. Private philanthropists, foundations, and corporations are playing an increasing role in funding land conservation efforts, especially through the direct acquisition of land for protection. So although the precise figures are also hard to pin down annually, it's estimated that billions of dollars in private funding are being directed towards conservation each year, and these can support either direct acquisition or conservation related activities. Listed here, you see a handful of the entities engaged in the Protecting Our Planet Challenge, and we'll probably recognize some of those names. This chart gives you a sense of just how significant these commitments or contributions can be. The Protecting Our Planet Challenge really links into the 30 by 30 initiative, recognizing that to protect 30% of the globe is going to require quite a bit of funding, and of course raises some of the issues that you all have been discussing as far as what does it mean for our wealthy corporations or individuals to really be driving the protection of resources in third world countries. Regardless, it's interesting just to look at some of these individuals, foundations, and corporations and the level that they're bringing in for conservation. So we are definitely in an era of corporate sustainability and social responsibility, and have seen a real uptick in programs oriented towards land conservation coming out of corporations. Some of these are really focused on voluntary offsets of carbon, initiatives oriented around companies becoming carbon negative. Microsoft is one of those examples. They've committed to becoming carbon negative by 2030, and that means investing directly in carbon offset programs through forest and land conservation. That company has pledged $1 billion to its Climate Innovation Fund that focuses on reforestation, soil carbon sequestration, and sustainable land management. Patagonia is one of the companies involved in 1% for the Planet, and Patagonia donates, along with the other companies that they have inspired, 1% annually to environmental nonprofits. This includes land conservation efforts, really with a focus on biodiversity, open space, and critical habitats around the world. And Apple is a company that also has initiated their own fund, the Restore Fund. In 2021, they launched that fund with $200 million aimed at removing carbon from the atmosphere by investing in forest and nature-based solutions.